This week on the show, we have strategic thinking to keep FreeBSD relevant. We are reflecting on the soul of a new machine a little bit. We have 10 gigabit Ethernet benchmarks on Linux distros and FreeBSD. We have also NetBSD integrating LLVM Sanitizers in base, as well as FreeNAS 11.2 on distrowatch. This week's episode of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 285, BSD Strategy, recorded on the 13th of February 2019. Hello, I'm your host, Benedikt Reuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And we have you back in this week's episode. Hopefully this is a little bit more lip-synced than last week's episode. Unfortunately, we found out at the very last minute, so sorry for that, but we'll try to fix this one here right away before things get out of line. And speaking of lines, we have headlines, as always, for you this week, starting with strategic thinking, or what we need to do to keep FreeBSD relevant.
Yep. So this is a post from Alexander Leidinger, who I've met and talked to a few times. And he goes on to say, since I participate in the FreeBSD project, there are from time to time some voices which say FreeBSD is dead and Linux is the way to go. Most of the time, these voices are trolls or people who don't really know what FreeBSD has to offer. Sometimes these voices wear blinders and they only see what's in their little world, which happens to be mostly Linux, and they think that's all that exists. And they don't see the big picture, especially more, competition simulates business, and having a monoculture of just Linux would actually be worse for everybody. Anyway. Sometimes those voices raise a valid concern, and it is up to the FreeBSD project to filter out those that would be beneficial. Recently, there was some mail on the FreeBSD list in the sense of, what about going into a certain direction? And I think the one he's alluding to was about writing things in Rust. Some people just had the opinion that we should stay where we are. In my opinion, that is similarly bad as saying that FreeBSD is already dead. Or if we just tried to always do what everybody else was doing, that'd be bad too. So we don't want to stagnate either. We should not hold people back from exploring new and different directions. Sometimes they may want to write a kernel module in Rust or whatever. Well, go ahead and give it a try. And in fact, that's already been done. And then, it can go in the ports tree and people can start playing with it. For my personal Alan opinion on this, I think that Rust is interesting, and if people want to start doing that, maybe it makes sense. I don't think that spending a bunch of time rewriting working code into another language in hopes of not breaking it is necessarily a good idea, but maybe we do want to consider having new things that we write built that way from the beginning, especially if we're using something like Rust that can interoperate with C nicely, means that we have the option of doing that, of just building new components the new way and leaving the old components undisturbed, or just maintaining them rather than just letting them rot, but make a slow transition rather than trying to do a big effort to forklist everything up and have a lot of churn that maybe doesn't actually have much benefit.
Yeah, the bootloader is actually a good example for that. Remember the old Forth code that we had in there, and now we're more in the Lua area?
Right, although most of the bootloader is still C and assembly, but yes, the menu system is much more approachable now. So anyway, this discussion on the mailing list also triggered some kind of where do we see us in the next few years kind of strategic thinking reflections. And that's what he wants to present here, is his own opinions about what we in the FreeBSD project might want to look at to stay relevant in the long term. To be able to put this into scope, I want to clarify what relevant means in this case. FreeBSD is currently used by companies like Netflix, NetApp, Cisco, Juniper, and many others as the base for products or services. It is also used by end users as a workhorse, like a mail server, web server, etc. Staying relevant means, in this context, to provide something which the user base is interested in and or that makes it easier or faster for the user to do what they want or deliver what they need to deliver. And this in terms of time to market to a solution, right? Like the amount of time to deliver a service. Or I think especially applies to if you're trying to make an appliance or a device like, say, NetApp is, making it easier to make the next version based on newer FreeBSD is one of the big selling points there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So they've categorized a list of items that they would like to that are important, and we'd like to see new features or code or documentation or polish or project infrastructure. And so we can look at that a little bit. In here. So it talks a bit about virtualization and trying to catch up there. While Beehive is coming along, Zen is actually pretty much there on FreeBSD right now, and I think is just not given the consideration it should be sometimes.
Mm.
But at the same time, I think there's a bunch of work that could go into FreeBSD to make it easier to do the cloud init type stuff, or just to feed the configuration in from outside of the box, and so on. And they also talk about ready-made containers and the fact that if we want to run ready-made Linux containers, we'd need an updated Linux emulator. Although at that point, if all the containers we want to run are Linux, it doesn't seem to make very much sense to do that on top of FreeBSD. So probably what we want to do is get it so that we can actually have native FreeBSD containers.
Yes, because even like this week, there was another exploit possible in the old infrastructure of Docker that made people break out of the Dockers and have full root privileges. So I would rather prefer the security of a BSD jail if that's possible to integrate.
There's also talk about Kerberos, and I know that it was one of the blockers when we were trying to fix OpenSSL in base to the newer version. And so getting that sorted out might be quite useful. There's also talk about software-defined networking and things like Open vSwitch, and yes, that would be good. Other parts of software-defined networking like Open Contrail and Tungsten Fabric, I guess they call it now, and other bits of OpenStack and Open Daylight and so on. They mentioned sensors in particular, getting information from motherboards and chassis and disks and whatever, and a bit about the old sensor framework from about 10 years ago that was done as a Google Summer of Code, but caused some problems, but never got replaced either. So while removing it may have been the right thing to do, not having a replacement doesn't seem like it was the right thing to do either. Also, to continue working on high availability and things like that, there was originally the reference implementation of MP multipath TCP was on FreeBSD, but it doesn't seem to have ever actually made it into FreeBSD. And it would be good if it did.
Yeah, especially in the networking area, we have a lot of good things to show, and probably the marketing, if you want to call it that, isn't that good we do.
And then documentation, well, FreeBSD has a reputation of having good documentation. That documentation has not aged well over the last 5 or 10 years and could use quite a bit of work, and there's just not that many people working on it. So need to get more people into working on that and get that sorted out. And part of that might actually be making that easier to do.
Yeah, I'll be the last one to dispute that. And definitely it could be improved in many places. It's just difficult to find the people to work on that or making it better, or get new people there to help out.
And they talk a bit about improving the tooling there, and then just general polish things in BSD. Details matter. If people have two options that are roughly the same features, which one are they going to take? We need to have the nicer, more, I wouldn't say productized, but complete solution, and if we want to win. One of the things that comes to mind there is dtrace. While dtrace works quite well, you need things like dwatch in order to actually make it a bit easier to work with. Or something like the ZFS storage analytics tools from Oracle to make it easier to actually have a dashboard or something with that data.
Mm. Yeah,
and then a common one is talking about the defaults in the ports tree. A bunch of those maybe could be better, and so on. Anyway, they go on and on about that. They talk a bit about the CI system, but we don't maybe make the best use of that yet. And then, we have some fuzzing projects underway, but we could really get that beefed up. And then, of course, there's the website could use a lot of work.
Yeah. Sure. Some of these things are being talked about, sometimes more, sometimes less, or they get back into the limelight from day to day. But it's difficult because some of these things are huge projects. They take a lot of time and effort to. It's not just from today to tomorrow we switch the website or some other infrastructure related project. But yeah, someone needs to get started on that and defines the path forward and says, okay, we'll have a path forward and a team together that's actually doing the work and is making progress.
Yep. So next up, we have slightly odd for BSD Now, but kind of a book review.
Yeah, one book I haven't read yet, but it's on my to-reading list. It's The Soul of the New Machine, and we have, of course, Brian Cantrell's deck chair.
One of the very few books that I've actually read. When I first started teaching, one of the other professors who I happened to share an office with and I were talking a bit, and I was mostly teaching sysadmin stuff, but we talked a little bit about my interest in FreeBSD and so on. And so he actually lent me his paperback copy of The Soul of a New Machine, and I basically took it home and read it and then gave it back to him. And I found it very interesting in the kind of seeing how a new computer system was designed. So if you've not heard of the book before, it's basically not a biography, really, just a history of how an early computer company that doesn't exist anymore built one of their new computers. I think it was one of the first 32-bit computers, and kind of the story of the struggle to do that and the setbacks and getting it working and making the decisions and so on. It was very interesting.
Okay. And so, Brian Cantrell mentioned this a couple of times in his talks, but now he has something on his blog, the observation deck, about the reflections on the soul of a new machine.
Right. So this was, I think, he recommended the book to some people, I think, including Jess Frizzell. And then she went on her vacation and read it and kind of live tweeted her reactions as she was reading through the book, and it kind of started a whole thing about it. And so this caused Brian to go back and reread the book that maybe he hadn't read in quite a while, and have a different perspective on it now that he's older and in a different position.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So basically, he says when he first read it, he was an undergraduate. He was on a break from school, and he was, browsing the family bookshelf and came across The Soul of a New Machine, took it off the shelf and read through it and found it very interesting. But that was over 2 decades ago now. And when he recommended the book to some other people, he came back to actually reading it himself. While he said he had referred to it at times over the years, reading certain sections or whatever, he hadn't actually read the whole thing again in a long time. So he says he's experienced a kind of reflected recommendation. I was inspired to reread the book that I was recommending to people. So shortly after I started reading, I began to realize that contrary to what I've been telling myself for years, I had not reread the book in full since that first reading more than 20 years ago. Rather, over the years, I had revisited certain sections and so on. And he says a particular visceral example that kind of stood out during the reread was early in the book, there's a feud between two rival projects that boils over into an argument at a Howard Johnson's, which is like a breakfast restaurant, that becomes known among the Data General engineers, that's the name of the company, was Data General, as the big shootout at Hojo's. So the author has little more to say about it. You know, the organizational civil war serves merely as a backdrop to the story of the computer they're building. And I don't recall this having an effect on me when I first read it. But reading it now, it resonates with a grim familiarity. In an engineering career of sufficient length, a beloved project will at some point be shelved or killed, and that moment will be sufficiently traumatic to be seared into the collective memory and memorialized in the local lore. So if you haven't yet had your own shootout at Hojo's, it's regrettably coming. And may your career be blessed with few of such firefights. But, you know, something that was just something that happened in the book before now was something that spoke to him a lot more. And anyway, there's more in there. I don't want to spoil the book for anybody, but it's definitely worth reading the book and then maybe looking at various people's different kind of reflections and reactions to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a couple of responses already in the comment section of the blog post, and I guess there will be more.
One of the comments is from the daughter of one of the focal characters in the book.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
If that's not great, then I don't know what. See, that's already
mostly
taking
she's
circles.
pointing out that, you know, make sure that you don't come away from the book without realizing that, you know, some of these people sacrificed a lot of time with their family to do what was done in the book and so on. And that, you know, maybe they ended up regretting that, but that was after the book kind of thing. Also, the book served as part of the inspiration for the TV show called Halt and Catch Fire, which is a bit more about making like an IBM PC clone and, you know, obviously dramatized a lot more. But, you know, if you want a TV show to binge watch, Halt and Catch Fire is partly inspired by this book. But so if you've seen the show and liked it, you should definitely check out the book because it's actually very good and more is very true to life, unlike a dramatized TV show.
I understand. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If that's not a recommendation for people for a long weekend, then yeah, get the book. So, time for the news roundup this week. We have an out-of-the-box 10 gigabit Ethernet network benchmark on 9 Linux distributions plus FreeBSD on Unix.
Yep. So they apparently last week started running some fresh 10 gigabit networking tests across Linux. And the tests have now been extended to cover 9 different Linux distributions plus FreeBSD 12 to compare its out-of-the-box network performance. So this is out of the box with no extra tuning. So they tested FreeBSD 12 against Integros 19.1, CentOS 7, Intel Clear Linux, Debian 9.6, Fedora Server 29. I didn't know there was a Fedora server. OpenSUSE Leap 15, OpenSUSE Tumbleweed, Ubuntu 18.04.1, and Ubuntu 18.10. The tests were done on a Tyan server board with 2 Intel Gold 6138s, 96 gigabytes of RAM, Samsung 970 EVO SSD, and the 10 gigabit capacity was provided by an add-in HP card, which is a 2-port QLogic 8214, which is actually a NIC I don't have any experience with. I've tried a lot of different 10 gig NICs on FreeBSD, but I've never come across the QLogic one.
Okay, so this is more exotic, you mean?
Well, I think it's what HP does by default, but I don't deal with HP servers very often.
Okay.
Although most HPs have Broadcom, actually, so I don't know. I'm just glad that one happens to work in FreeBSD, or this test wouldn't have been very...
It would only be 9 Linux distributions and not being worth mentioning in this episode.
Right. So the first test they did was 60 seconds of iPerf 3 with one concurrent connection. And in that test, FreeBSD 12 beat most of the Linuxes, or all of the Linuxes, actually. So most of the Linuxes were in the 7550 to 75 megabits range, but FreeBSD was over a full gigabit per second faster. The only laggard was the Intel Clear Linux, which only did about 6 gigabits. If these are all on the same machine, that seems a little weird. Although I do notice that Clear Linux compiled with quite a few different compile flags on iPerf. Then they did another test, same thing, but they did 5 parallel connections. And that caused pretty much all of the Linuxes to get exactly the same score, along with FreeBSD, basically saturating the card. And so basically every one of the OSs was able to max out the 10 gig, except Clear Linux and Ubuntu 18.10 for some reason.
Huh. Interesting.
Yes, so Ubuntu 18.10 got slower when you oversubscribed it a bit.
Is that their server edition or their desktop thing?
And then they did yet another test where they bumped the number of parallels up to 20. And again, most of the OSs reached the physical limit of the card. And then Clear Linux got maybe just marginally faster, and Ubuntu got slower.
Huh.
But it's only Ubuntu 18.10. Ubuntu 18.04 was with the rest of the pack. So something changed there, and maybe it's a regression.
Probably, yeah. Good to know
then
for
they
them.
tried a different program called NutTCP. And with that, again, FreeBSD well out ahead of the Linuxes. And then with NetPerf for 60 seconds on TCP request response, FreeBSD was out in front of everyone except the Intel Clear Linux, which this is the first test that Clear Linux wasn't near the end of the pack, suggesting that maybe it was tuned specifically for this type of workload out of the box.
Mm-hmm. So that looks promising.
But so overall, in the tests they did there, they actually compared FreeBSD. FreeBSD was either in first or second place out of the 10 different distros.
Okay. That's promising, yeah. I mean, there's always room for improvement, but I think in the networking space, there's been a lot of work recently and in the previous release as well. So that's looking like it's giving already some promising results in benchmarks. I mean, benchmarks are always some kind of measuring, but the real performance gains are the people who are using that to their full.
It'd be interesting to test a bunch of different network cards, although it's more complicated than it sounds because you have to do things like test all of them using the same PCIe slot, because a different slot might be in a different NUMA domain and would affect the results of your test. And you have to make sure that you actually pin the test and the interrupt threads and so on the same. You can very easily end up benchmarking something different than you actually thought you were benchmarking.
The test
see a
setup
difference
is
between
important.
see a difference between these two cards, and it was caused by some outside factor that wasn't actually the card. And so it gets very complicated. So as always, take the Phoronix results with a grain of salt, but in their pretty straightforward out-of-the-box test of using iPerf and NetPerf, they found FreeBSD performed very, very well.
Excellent. Next up, we have the integration of the LLVM Sanitizers with the NetBSD base system. So remember a couple episodes ago, we talked about we covered the LLVM Sanitizers in NetBSD, or how NetBSD improves on integrating LLVM into their base system. And this is yet another update, writing that over the past month, this is over at the NetBSD blog, of course. Over the past month, they've merged the LLVM compiler RT sanitizers in the base system, and they've also managed to get a functional set of makefile rules to build all of them. So namely ASAN, UBSAN, TSAN, MSAN, libfuzzer, safestack, and X-ray. And in all supported variations and modes that are supported by the original LLVM compiler RT package. So that looks promising. And they've submitted a patch for internal review, but it was pushed through Tech Toolchain first, their mailing list. They're still waiting for active feedback on moving it in the proper direction. And the final merge of build rules will be done once they get LLVM 8.2 RC2 in the base, as there's a small ABI mismatch between LLVM 7.0 from SVN and compiler RT version 8.0 from SVN. And they adapted with a hack all the upstream tests for supported sanitizers to be executed against the newly integrated ones with the base system, and everything has been adjusted to pass with a few exceptions. And that still needs to be fixed. So ASAN dynamic.so tests are still crashy, and UBSAN tests were around 1/3 of them failing due to an ABI mismatch, which caused a number of new features for UBSAN that are not supported by older Clang LLVM. And the changes integrated with LLVM projects, there have been a branching of LLVM 8.0 in the middle of January, causing a lot of breakage. That required collaboration with the LLVM people to get things back into proper shape. They've also taken part in the LLD porting effort, the debugger, with Michael Gorney. And post-branching point, there was also refactoring of existing features in compiler RT, such as LSAN, SafeStack, and Scudo. They had to apply appropriate patches in these sanitizers and temporarily disable LSAN until it can be fully ported. And so the changes in the actual base system are, out of the context of sanitizers, they fixed 2 bugs that relate to the previous work of interfaces for debuggers. So there's 2 PRs here to mention: random panics in VFS mount root and ptrace wait tracemem v4 crash bus test cases fail. So these are the 2. And the next milestone there is to collect feedback for the patch integrating LLVM sanitizers and merge the final version with the base system. Return to ptrace kernel fixes and start to work with a focus on improving correctness of signal handling. And as always, this work was sponsored by the NetBSD Foundation and definitely benefiting NetBSD as a whole. Good luck with the integration work, and there will definitely be future project updates from that side.
And then over at DistroWatch, they've done their review of FreeNAS 11.2. I say the project's latest release, FreeNAS 11.2, at first I nearly overlooked the new version because it appeared to be a minor point release. However, a lot of work went into the new version, and 11.2 offers a lot of changes compared to 11.1, including a major revamp of the web interface, support for self-encrypting drives, and new backward-compatible REST and WebSocket APIs. These updates are also introduce IOCage for improved plugin and gel management and simplified plugin development. I definitely found the web interface for creating a pool in 11.2 to be far superior, especially when you wanted to do things like select which disks go in which pool. In my case, I wanted to create a RAID Z3 of 3 drives each from 4 different shelves. And so I had to manually pick the drives. I reported some bugs with the interface, but it became actually possible to use the web interface to do that. Whereas in 11.1, it was pretty much impossible to do it that way. Aside from going through the whole web interface like 140 times. And especially the problem there was it takes a long time to load. There are still some other improvements I would really like to see in FreeNAS, especially with regards to trying to import the pool and get the list of drives and so on. even though I told it in the web interface, no, the pool I'm trying to import does not have any encryption, it still runs a Geli dump on every hard drive, which probably works fine in a testing VM with 2 or 4 hard drives or something. But on a real machine with 168 hard drives, that takes a long time to run disk info, Geli dump, gparcho, and like 8 other commands on every single drive. What takes 2 or 3 seconds to load in a small setup suddenly doesn't scale at all when you have 168 hard drives. Anyway, their impressions from the review here say the FreeNAS boots to a text console where you can do some basic configuration and get directed to use the web interface. I think it's worth mentioning that there's no password protection on that console. Anyone with physical access or remote access via the BMC or into the virtual machine has root access and can access the shell, changing your settings and taking the system offline. In a large business environment where the NAS is likely to be behind a locked door, this is probably convenient, but in a small office, it might be problematic. Exploring the command line options, I found FreeNAS runs about 32 different processes on a fresh install using about 460 megabytes of memory and 310 megabytes of wired memory, the bulk of that being for ZFS. They say the web interface is served over HTTP only. HTTPS is not enabled out of the box, but you can add it later, mostly having to do with certificates. The web interface begins by showing us a dashboard with an overview of the server's hardware. One personal Allen critique of that is it shows the raw size of the disks, not the usable size. And so that will always lead to people being disappointed when they're like, oh, I logged in my machine that has 1 petabyte of usable space, but it claims it has 1.4 petabytes of usable space. It's like, yeah, well, most of that's used up by the RAID Z3 and other things. Maybe it should show the actual amount of space you could use, not the total amount that's available to ZFS. But in general, I found the new UI much nicer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looks clear and easy, although, especially if you have a lot of options, that it's still not overwhelming.
It's still a little weird to navigate on my laptop with the only 1080p screen without 4K, especially without a real mouse, which is the trackpad. I sometimes had a bit of difficulty, although that's mostly just I'm not very adept with a trackpad because I normally use a real mouse.
Sure, yeah.
Anyway, they have a very detailed review, so if you're interested in getting a preview of what FreeNAS 11.2 looks like, check it out.
So, time for the Beastie Bits this week. We have for you, as first thing, instructions for installing Refined to dual boot a computer with FreeBSD and Windows, and possibly other OSs as well. Nicholas Seising, who we interviewed a couple weeks ago, provided this, and it gives you basically everything that you need to do the dual booting with EFI, especially if you're switching.
Yeah, so this is installing Refined as an EFI application, and then it will give you a graphical menu to pick your OSs. When I've done this to my laptop, I've always had to do the install of Refined from Windows because the EFI management tools for FreeBSD didn't exist. But now they do. So this tutorial walks you through actually using the EFI boot manager command on FreeBSD to add FreeBSD to the list and activate it and configure Refined so that you will get a menu at boot and be able to choose between Windows and FreeBSD.
Yeah, which is excellent if you're still not sure whether you stick with one of the two OSs or want to copy files around or check on one thing.
In my case, it was on the older ThinkPad. It was I need to be able to boot Windows to record interviews at conferences.
Oh, right, yeah.
And the rest of the time, I will run FreeBSD.
Of course.
It also came in handy before I had the Mac when, I need to make a Skype call or something, so I'll boot Windows for that. But yes, so this has all the instructions on setting up Refind and making it the default, and then having Refind let you select between your different boot programs. Sadly, Refind itself is GPL licensed, so we can't build it into FreeBSD. However, Refind is actually based on a previous project that was abandoned called Refit. Refit itself was actually BSD licensed. So if some people were actually interested, it might be nice to go back to the Refit code, which is still languishing around on SourceForge, and see if it's possible to actually get it working up to a minimum usable state, so that maybe FreeBSD could install Refit by default, and make the installer have options to coexist with Windows and so on a little nicer.
Oh, yes. Would this be a good Google Summer of Code project?
It could be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yeah, you heard it here before, and
it might be.
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of experience you need to actually work on something like Refit. But yes, it might actually be a good Google Summer of Code project. I just don't know who they would get to mentor them. Somebody who understands EFI, like Eric McCorkle or somebody.
Probably, yeah. Good candidate. Yeah, but other than that, check it out and dual boot to your heart's content. Next item we have is NetBSD Desktop Part 6, the VI Editor, Tmux, and Unicode Terminal over at United BSD. So this is part of a series, as you might have guessed, and describing how you can make your terminal experience a little bit nicer than just gray terminals. You also have Unicode support.
There's an environment variable, term, which defines what type your terminal is. And so these are how you would get a UTF-8 aware terminal for NetBSD. So the terminal environment variable defines a set of capabilities and behavioral procedures of all CLI programs. By looking at the term info database for the descriptions, this is essential for programs that like drawing pipes on standard out and so on, or for example, graphical editor like VI. Well, maybe graphical is wrong. Visual editor like VI. And naturally, all programs rely on curses or slang or something like that. A broken or null or dumb term easily screws up all those applications. So the RxVT-Unicode terminal emulator includes a nice term description for modern displays and supports 256 colors and UTF-8. Unfortunately, the package source package neither installs nor compiles these descriptions into the default version. So they actually show how to set the package options, enabling Unicode and so on, and then recompile the RxVT Unicode package.
Yeah, and of course these packages also work on other BSDs or other Unix systems, so it's not NetBSD specific.
Yep, and then they talk about some of the differences between VI, NVI, Vim, and so on. Lots of different editor commands and stuff they covered there, including setting up, their dot files and so on.
Yeah, and how to exit the VI editor without rebooting your machine. Well, it's good to know, definitely.
They also talk about Tmux and using that and configuring it however you prefer it. Setting all the key bindings and so on.
Yeah, it's definitely a good start, and a couple of commands are in there that I didn't even know. That's not a reference.
Yep. So if you're interested, most of this stuff will apply, maybe with a little adapting for the package system and so on, to any of the BSDs.
Yeah, and next we have Unix Flowers for you. This might sound a little bit weird at first, but we found this at geekgrant.org, and they were digging around in Unix system directories on macOS 10 today, or actually searching for Joe, which they thought it installed, but it was nowhere to be found, and stumbled upon the directory user share Misc. Within that folder, there's the file Flowers, which is a listing of flowers and their meanings. So yeah, that's the listing here, and it's short, but maybe people find some interesting things in there. So here is, for example, let's see, what do we start with? So African violet, it's such worth is rare. Or apple blossom, preference. Or the bachelor's button, celibacy. Yeah, in case you don't know what you should put in your mail signature, then maybe you can draw something from that file. But you see that it had some meanings. And remember, it's all the Berkeley code. Oh, that's the last change date from the top comment here. August 6th, 1993. Could be. Maybe they abandoned that file at some point. But I guess it will be in various Unixes. So maybe they have more flowers there or more meanings.
Yeah, I have no idea where they came from or what it was for. Like, I know there was a dictionary and some other things included by default, but I'm not sure what this one is for.
Mm.
The format doesn't look very... Well, it's got no space after the colon or something, so it seems like it's kind of meant to be machine parsed, but having chrysanthemum, comma, space, red seems like that is a little anti-machine parsing. So I don't know.
Yeah, with Valentine's Day coming up, this might be worth for someone.
Apparently, you should give clovers instead of roses.
Yeah. Just to let you know, yeah, this is the proper flower to buy. Yeah, so Misc is interesting in Unix. People mentioned in the chat here that there's also birth tokens, for example, and yeah, that's to get bored on Unix, check out that directory. We also have more interesting stuff from our favorite, or one of the favorite bloggers, Mariusz Zaborski, about FreeBSD upgrade procedure using GPT. And he even have a little bit of graphics there, or at least explanatory pictures.
Yeah, so he's if you ever wonder how the GPT partition scheme works, this has good detail on that. But he goes on, you have a few different ways to upgrade your operating system. For example, if you're using ZFS as your root file system, you can use boot environments to accomplish this task in a quick, simple, and safe way. Boot environments are the new it thing in FreeBSD. However, today, we will discuss the more old-school approach to this problem using GPT flags, which is something I think Pavel... I'm thinking of the wrong Pavel now. Pavel Doedek came up with specifically to port something kind of like NanoBSD to GPT. This approach may be used to upgrade your operating system even if you don't use ZFS and you want your system to be on read-only partitions or something like that. So he looks at these GPT posters that Jared Atkinson came up with, showing where the bits of GPT live. So the GPT is divided into two parts. First, the GPT header, and then the partition array. As you can see, every partition entry contains some attributes. Each operating system may implement its own set of attributes. According to Wikipedia, Microsoft is already using bit 60 for read-only, 62 for hidden, and 63 for do not auto-mount. FreeBSD implements three additional ones: boot me, boot once, and boot failed. That are respectively 59, 58, and 57, which are not used by anything else. The boot me attribute points to the partition which should be used to boot from. If there is a partition with two flags, like boot me and boot once, then this partition is chosen to be booted from, but it will be used only one time. How does the bootloader accomplish this? Simply by removing the boot me attribute from it when it sees boot once. So as soon as it tries to boot, it'll remove the boot me and boot once flags, so that next time, if that boot doesn't work and you power cycle a machine, it'll go back to the normal partition instead of the one time only partition.
Yeah, that's clever.
It also sets the boot failed attribute on the partition, and then if the boot actually succeeds, it erases that. So in their little example here, they create a new GPT partition table, add a boot partition and two UFS partitions. Then they set boot me flag on partition number 2. And so when you do gpart show, you can see that the first of the 3 UFS partitions, of course, they only showed creating 2. Anyway, the first of the 2 UFS partitions has the boot me flag. So when you boot from a partition that has the boot me flag, then it just works. So when you want to upgrade, you'll boot from the partition number 2, then write a new image into partition number 3, and then you set the boot once flag on partition number 3. So now you can see that partition 3 has the boot once boot me flag set. When you reboot, it will erase the boot me flag and boot this partition. Now that the boot me flag is gone, it means next time it won't boot that one. It'll go back to booting the regular one. So if the upgrade doesn't work, you'll be okay. So now your upgrade occurs or not. If it's actually fails to boot, it will replace the boot once flag with the boot failed flag, and then you'll be able to detect that when you boot back into the original image and be able to alert that the upgrade didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is another partition with the boot once and boot me attributes, then it would be tried then, and so on. So when an upgrade was successful, the difference is that the system will remove the boot once flag and report success. The reporting is done by the startup script GPT boot. If you're using the boot once flag as an upgrade procedure, it is a good idea to modify this script, and if the upgrade was successful, change that boot once to boot me so that the new version becomes the default. The logic in the bootloader is also more complicated than what he actually talked about. You can have multiple boot once and boot me attributes on different partitions. If these are set and only problem is with the booting kernel, there's no need to reboot the machine. The loader can actually automatically try other kernels. I pointed that out. I prefer to do the reboot because it's useful for our upgrade process is handling more complicated things, like, for example, upgrading a database. We can imagine that we have one additional partition with data which we don't want, which we don't overwrite. So we have two system partitions that we bounce back and forth upgrading with images, and then the third partition actually contains like your database and your stuff you want to be persistent.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to what ZFS in boot environments does, except for you have to partition your disk to get these, and each one has a fixed size, whereas with ZFS, you can create as many file systems as you want, and the free space is shared between them instead of each one being a fixed size. But it's very nice to be able to understand how the previous system worked, or how to accomplish something like this with UFS, especially if you're going to have a read-only system or have a very small disk or very small amount of memory, where UFS will make more sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a nice write-up to actually make it more palatable to see, it's working, and how to actually booting is not trivial, and it's working so well.
I wrote an entire paper just on how boot works, and I didn't even cover this bit of it. I could write a whole different paper on just
that's the second part. Yeah.
Fail-safe booting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Then we have pull-based backups using OpenBSD base. So this one goes. They describe the MySQL dump scripts and approaches to backing up a database at one point, and they know that it isn't an OpenBSD base because MySQL is support, but it says just added for a specific system, and it's easy to add it, and everything else is done through tools from the base system. And so they describe that they basically have this Chargen account, Chargen.1. They want to protect the user data and be able to easily restore that. And the important things for the backup here are that single timestamps backup files are there. No additional software is installed above what's already on the box. Backups are pulled from a central server, not pushed to one. They have a portable script and use privilege separation, of course, so local accounts can't access the backups. And they talked a bit about other things they tried, like Borg backup, and they use a huge NAS now to store the backups, and then they start configuring the backup accounts for the home partition and walk you through how to set up the SSH key generation and run through the MySQL data backup procedure.
But they even just dump the list of packages so that they can feed it into their package manager to reinstall those in the future and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then they do tarring up the files that they want to have and include some of the those they don't want to have. And yeah, then creating the final archive. And yeah, then you have the full backup script at the end of the post here, so you can use it or adjust it to your needs in case you have other backup needs. But yeah, this is a pretty straightforward way of doing that.
And now, I guess we didn't actually cover it, but the OpenRSync project has been integrated into OpenBSD.
Oh, excellent. So, they're quick on that.
Soon, yeah. I thought it was a number of months more away from being very usable.
Okay, they trusted enough to integrate that. That's already something. And I guess they will polish it further and make it more complete, if you can say that. Yeah, so that's a good integration here. All right, yeah. Next up, we have developing WireGuard for NetBSD. That's interesting because WireGuard is making the rounds or making the news. That's over on GitHub, and they have the in-kernel implementation of WireGuard for NetBSD. Nice. And the needed kernel options are listed here. Of course, you need to clone the repo to get that. And then basically how to use that, you create a couple of interfaces with ifconfig, and then you generate the key, the private key, and configure the keys with that private key or the interfaces with that private key. Add a peer to it with hopefully a different key than the one displayed here. And then you try to send package over those, and hopefully you get a reply. So there's a caveat section, but it looks promising so far.
Yeah, looks like it has to pull in libsodium and so on into the kernel, but other than that, it does look pretty interesting. I wonder how long before maybe somebody tries porting this to FreeBSD.
Yeah, I guess this is the groundwork already, and hopefully the porting work is easy for the other BSDs. And next up, this is Alan's news item here. The ZFS User Conference is here, April 18 till 19 in Norwalk, Connecticut.
Yes, so if you use ZFS and you'd like to come out to the east coast of the US, or if that's nearby for you, you should definitely come out. There are also speaker slots still open. They have 30-minute slots, so that's about 20 minutes of talking or 25 minutes of talking and a few minutes of questions. So there are a number of speaker slots still available. So if you are using some... this is a user conference, so if users actually want to hear from other users, and the developers would like to hear how people are using ZFS. So it doesn't have to be, I've made this change to ZFS. It's not the ZFS Developer Summit, it's the ZFS User Conference. So we want to hear how you're using ZFS, where ZFS isn't working as well as it should for you, anything like that. So there are plenty of speaker slots available, and we look forward to seeing many people at the ZFS User Conference.
Yep, that's definitely something to look forward to or talk to. I mean, we never know what interesting use cases ZFS sees in companies or even private use. So that's the conference you should speak at.
Yes, I know in previous years, a company came and talked about how their time series database created a worst possible case fragmentation problem on ZFS. And then they got advice on how to solve that and so on. And, a lot of useful things have come out of this conference, and I would look forward to talking to more people that are just using ZFS and how they would like to see that be easier or better.
Yeah, because user feedback is important. So you'll be speaking? That's already set?
Yes. I think my topic is going to expand slightly because they gave me a 1-hour slot.
Oh, demo time.
I'm going to talk a little bit. No, I'm going to talk a little bit more about tiered storage and how to make that, how we would want to build that into ZFS.
Excellent.
In addition to thanks. And related to the VDEV properties work.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know you talked a bit about before, so I look forward to seeing that. And yeah, thank you to Dato for hosting that conference again. And yeah, look forward to it. Although I can't go because I will be in Aberdeen during that time. But yeah, it's certainly something to watch.
Mm-hmm. Hope to see some people there.
Yeah. So Noxbug, they have been meeting for a number of years now, but this one is on February 25th, their next iteration of the BSD user group in Knoxville, Tennessee, with Joe Maloney talking about how to set up Jenkins for continuous integration testing.
Yeah, I'll cover basic installation, setting up Nginx as a proxy in front of it, how to do authentication, matrix-based security, storing Git credentials, creating additional Jenkins nodes, running local jobs, adding test results, publishing artifacts. So like you can have it automatically make an ISO or an executable or whatever. How to send email alerts, how to build plugins, and adding a job from Git.
Oh yeah, that's already something. A lot of things you can do with that. They are they recorded somehow or streamed?
I'm not
or
sure.
Do you have to be?
But it will take place at the IX Systems office in Tennessee.
Okay. Or maybe we see Joe Maloney give that talk somewhere else, maybe, if it's that popular. Yep. So yeah, if you're in the area, check it out. Go there, say hi to a couple people, and talk all things BSD. Speaking of all things BSD, it's time for the feedback and questions in this week's episode. We want to keep doing this session unless you don't provide us feedback. So yeah, send us everything that you have, questions, comments, show notes, ideas, stories that you would like to see in the show. Everything goes to feedback@bsdnow.tv. Or you can also hit us up on the Twitters. But yeah, this is the easiest way to reach us. So first one who wrote us is Jake about C programming. This starts with the following. Good morning. Thanks for continuing to do the show. Do I remember correctly that Alan taught himself to program in C? If so, how? He just finished reading a beginner C programming book and got through it fine, but don't know where to go next. Do you guys have some suggestions?
So basically, I think the big start of it was 20 years ago, reading the source code for the IRC server that I was using and making some small modifications to it. Just, adding an if here or there or whatever, and not really understanding dereferencing pointers and causing it to crash a lot and so on. Then I mostly did other programming languages, a lot of PHP and Perl and so on, which all have a C-like syntax. Which meant I understood the syntax pretty well, just not necessarily, the finer points of pointers and memory management and so on. And then when I got to try actually programming C, I think one of the most valuable resources for me was actually the libc man pages on FreeBSD. The fact that many of basically the built-in functions of C or of FreeBSD all have man pages with the list of all of the inputs and what the error messages it could send are, and even sometimes example code. I found that quite useful. And then beyond that, it was mostly reading a lot of existing code. Turns out having access to the source code for an entire operating system means that you can always think it was like, oh, I want to know how to do foo. Well, which program does that on FreeBSD? Let's go look at the source code for that. And so, I looked at the source code for the MD5 command, which basically reads a file and then
creates the hash
calculates
for
its hash and prints it back out and so on. It's relatively straightforward, although it does do a couple of slightly complicated things in the fact that it's built to do all the different hashing algorithms. So it's actually one binary that then does it for, MD5, SHA-1, SHA-256, SHA-512, etc. And a lot of the heavy lifting is actually done by a library, which you can go read too. But mostly, I think the biggest part for me was actually just having a project of mine. The first thing I wanted to do was the little tool I started writing called UCL CMD, which used a an existing C library, libucl, and I wanted to be able to interact with it from the command line and basically read a JSON file and be able to print out, a certain sub value or subtree. And so it was just because I knew what I wanted. I knew what I had for input, this JSON file, and I knew which I wanted for output. So it was just a matter of playing with it until I got that to work. So yes, I think the biggest thing with learning almost anything about Unix or programming or whatever is just having a kind of smallish but tractable goal in mind. There's something you want to do and accomplish, and you might have to go down some other alleys and learn some other stuff first, but by having somewhere you're trying to go, it makes it easier to get there than just be like, well, I want to learn C programming is a lot harder to do than I want to make a small C program that does X. That's much more something that you can actually work towards and actually see yourself getting there as you get closer and closer to the output you want, versus just the kind of ambiguous goal of learning C.
Yeah. I would also recommend getting another C book, because one book explains it only in one way and another book might have different content or explain it in a different way. And give yourself a little project, because programming is only learned by actually doing the programming, not by reading much, but you can still reference a lot of material out there. And Architect actually from the chat room points out that you should start writing useless things and start scratching your own itches. Look, for Architect, for example, wrote a basic IP address calculator because he didn't want to install one with features he didn't need. And then he got into it more and more. And so little project for your own amusement or use even, and then from there on you get the experience and can move on to other projects.
Yes, and they also mention use a version control system, learn Git or Subversion or something, because especially when you're just iterating and stuff, you're going to want to be able to go back and get, older versions of your code and so on. Or undo a change that you made only after you only found out it was a bad idea a week after working on it. Wanting to go back is nice to be able to go back and not have to go find, foo.old.backup and so on.
Yeah, get the old version that was not broken by some error or something that you just thought you would fix. But that's normal. I mean, and there's also a bunch of good forums out there and advice. So if you get stuck somewhere, then you have someone to ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For me, like a lot of my early programming was actually done in Visual Basic on Windows. Back in the early or late 90s. But it was, again, scratching my own itch. I made a little program to generate random passwords because I needed to send them to customers all the time when I reset their password. And so just having a little something that would generate them was nice. Or, I had a little tool that I made my own slideshow program because I had a CD full of images for my dad, and I wanted it so that when you put it in the computer, it would just auto start a slideshow and you could press escape to make it go away. So I did that. Or, it was always little things like that. Some of them were ridiculous. Like back when I was like 14, I didn't know that there was such thing as a protocol analyzer, something like TCP dump or Wireshark. So when I wanted to figure out how web browsers talked to websites, I made a little program that listened on port 80 on localhost, and when you connected, proxied what you sent to another socket that went and connected to the website, and then pointed my browser at localhost. And then quickly learned about the host header and how if you tell your browser it's going to localhost, the web server at /dot is not going to answer. It's going to be like, oh, you don't want the /dot, you want some other domain, and you get a weird website, and you're like, what's going on here?
Yeah, well, but it kept you interested, and basically that's what the people started.
How much more damage I could have done if someone had just told me about EtherCap or EtherPeak or Wireshark or something like that. I don't think Wireshark existed back then, but you get the idea.
Yeah, and you quickly explore, especially with C, that you will find that there's a lot of things that it touches with the operating system, or that you need operating system knowledge to understand the basic concepts, or
yes and no.
Well, yeah, you can keep it at an abstraction layer that's very high level, but you can also go deeper depending on your interest.
So next question.
But so we have covered that. Next up is Farhan with an explanation of router advertisement. Damon, I think that it's. It's short, asking us, can you do an episode on the explanation of RT8DVD? I'm trying to set up a router to advertise, but I've never been able to get that working in a jail. I've never seen packets even hit the E-pair or bridge or anything.
So if it's an E-pair, it's a VMH jail, so that might actually work, whereas obviously running router advertiser in a vanilla, like non-VMH jail would probably not work, but in a VMH jail it should.
So one end of the jail is sending the advertisements and the other end is receiving them, or what's the
I think
setup?
he wants his router to advertise v6 to machines outside of the physical machine.
Oh, that would make sense, yeah.
But yeah, if they're not hitting the other end of the E-pair, let alone the bridge, then it's hard to say. I've never actually used RT8DVD. Most of my experience with v6 is on servers on the internet where I just have a static allocation, nothing auto-assigned. I don't know.
If someone else
knows, they should write something up and explain it to us, because it's obviously something that people have questions about.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing. And with an upcoming jail book by a certain author, I guess that will become even more popular in that space. Just to tease a little bit. A good book. Next up is Nelson with the bug bounties on open source software, which is actually from last year, if I'm not mistaken. So it's
from December, but yeah.
Yeah. So this story might be a fodder for a future BSD Now webcast. In January, the European Union starts running bug bounties on free and open source software. And yeah, I got this from someone else as an email. And yeah, so they have an update from January 16, with more bug bounties becoming alive. They have a full list in that. So it's basically finding bugs and giving money for all of the ones that they are found, and projects can enroll in that bug bounty. And
so there's bounties for FileZilla, Notepad++, Putty, VLC, and lots of other stuff. KeyPass, 7-zip. What I'd be more interested to know is, or to see maybe, would actually be a bug bounty program similar to this, but the bounty is for fixing it.
Yeah, finding is one thing.
Yeah, so a general bug bounty program is about reporting the vulnerability, but for open source stuff like this, it'd be nice to actually see the bounty cover actually coming up with the fix. Although, in some of these cases, a developer from the project may be a better person to develop the fix than the person who finds the bug. But maybe what the bug bounty system should do is split a bounty between the person who finds the bug and the person who fixes the bug.
And
so that it also makes sure that the bugs get fixed, not just found.
Yeah, and some of these things, or most of these projects listed here, except maybe the GNU C library, glibc, are userland programs and not much operating system related, but definitely finding bugs is good. And yeah, maybe there will be more
things people use a lot.
Sure.
It's nice to see a bug bounty for Putty because lots of people use that.
Yeah, so definitely something to watch, and thanks for letting us know. We could probably revisit this throughout the year and see if there's something new. And yes, this pretty much wraps up our episode this week. Thank you for listening. And as always, if you have something, send it to feedback@bsdnow.tv, and then we'll have more show content in the future. Thank you. See you next week.
See you next week.